The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to Urban Fantasist, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic, and folklore. And now here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
It's Thursday the 21st of September. Time for another episode of the Urban Fantasist Weird Tales, Magic and Folklore radio show. We've a full programme for you today. We've got royal ghosts, we've got obscure eyebrow folklore, we go urban myth busting with the ghostly carriage that isn't of Potter Higham, we've got a magic spell for Mabon, we've got a Maymar James interview, we've also got Boudica and Harry Potter. Did you know there's a connection between them? We've got the Salem witch trials. We have some very obscure forms of divination, which I think you'll enjoy. There's a little section we've got on all you need to know about werewolves and why you've been doing it wrong for so long. And we also make a little foray towards Hartlepool and ask the question, did they once hang a monkey because they thought it was a Frenchman? I'm Charles Christian. Let's get on with the show. And we start with an item from Janie.
We start, as ever, with what weird things happened on this day in history.
We've got a couple of classics. The Ghost of a Murdered King Who Walks Tonight and the end of the Salem Witch Trials saga. We'll be looking at both those in more detail later on in the show. But in the meantime, here's some literary anniversaries for you. This day in 1866 saw the birth of the British writer H.G. Wells, whose novels include The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. This day in 1937 saw the first publication of The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and this day in 1947 saw the birth of the American novelist Stephen King, whose most recent screen adaptation is of his novel It, which features Pennywise, the demonic clown.
Did you know the fear of creepy clowns is now so widespread it has its own name, coulrophobia? Anyway, I've a more sweet anniversary. On this day in 1897, the New York Sun ran an editorial that answered a question from an 8-year-old Virginia O'Hanlon. "Is there a Santa Claus?" she asked. Editor Francis P. Church replied, "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. He exists as certainly as love and generosity and devotion exist. And you know that they abound and give your life its highest beauty and joy." Following on from our piece on Redenhall Church last time and the number of yew trees in the churchyard, a listener has been in touch to say, did we know there are at least 500 churchyards in England that contain yew trees older than the building itself? And is this in any way connected to pre-Christian pagan rituals?
No, we didn't know that. But it's actually unlikely the yew trees predate the arrival of Christianity, as the trees only live for about 1,000 years. A more probable explanation is while the yews are older than the current church, they were actually planted when an earlier building occupied the site.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what's this thing with yew trees in churchyards? Why so many?
Naturally, there are not one but several theories. First is that it was to ensure each parish had plenty of yew wood to make longbows, which was the original English weapon of mass destruction for over 500 years. That's unlikely, as yews are very slow growing. The second is yew trees were planted on the graves of plague victims to protect and purify the dead. And the third, admittedly rather more boring explanation, is yews were planted as hedging to keep out grazing cattle, which would die if they ate the toxic foliage.
I wonder how many cows had to die before a herd twigged the trees were poisonous. Incidentally, did you know it's unlucky to bring a yew into the house as part of your Christmas decorations? If you do, you'll have a death in the family before the end of the year. Though, given the toxic nature of yew foliage, this is not so much a folklore saying as a health and safety risk warning.
We promised you a royal ghost for tonight's haunting. However, before we go into details, this is a very gory story, so listeners of a nervous disposition may want to turn away now. The location is Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire in England, and on the night of the 21st September there is an annually recurring manifestation of the ghost of King Edward II. Well, actually, the haunting takes the form of the sound of the king's tortured screams echoing around the castle's corridors, recalling the night he was murdered in 1327. Why the screams? Because according to the legend, he was murdered in a particularly unpleasant way. Edward had been on the losing side of another little mini-civil war and had been imprisoned at Berkeley after having been deposed by his wife Queen Isabella and her lover Sir Roger Mortimer. His jailers, acting on the orders of the new regime, apparently murdered him by inserting a red-hot poker up his fundament. This may have been a very clumsy attempt to disguise the cause of death, or, as one of the church chroniclers of the time said, it was actually some form of medieval irony, as Edward was rumoured to have been a homosexual and had affairs with two of his court favourites, Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser the younger. And if you think Edward's death was painful, spare a thought for Hugh Despenser. Found guilty of treason, he was tied to a ladder and, in full view of a crowd, had his genitals sliced off and burned in front of his still conscious eyes. Then his entrails were pulled out, and finally his heart was cut out and thrown onto a bonfire. However, if that gives you nightmares, there are at least two other versions explaining the death of King Edward. The first is that, thanks to depression, ill health, he just died of natural causes in the castle. The second version is that he opted for a life of anonymity and lived quietly in retirement until he died of old age.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. We all know about top folklore stories and legends, you know, Robin Hood, vampires and all that, but some of the folklore about us, as in normal folk, is just as fascinating.
Like what?
Well, take eyebrows for instance. That's real ones, not the painted on type so fashionable at the moment. I'm talking eyebrows that meet in the middle, or a monobrow if you like. I thought my dad had made this one up to stop me dating the Neanderthal-looking men, but no, in the 16th century, a meeting of eyebrows signified a wicked person, and then later even a witch or a warlock. To be fair though, there's folklore to say that a monobrow is lucky. In Roman and Greek times, women wore false monobrows made of dyed goat's hair glued on with tree resin. And eyelashes too, they have their own folklore. This is from the mid-1800s. If an eyelash falls out, place it on the back of your hand and throw it over your shoulder, making a wish at the same time. And if the eyelash is gone, your wish will come true. Of course, you may give yourself a nasty whiplash-type shoulder injury as well. Still, while on the head area, burning ears and cheeks, meaning somebody is talking about you, goes even further back. First written about in the 1st century, AD 77, by Pliny. If your right cheek is burning, it means someone is saying something beastly about you. So if you pinch your cheek, they will bite their tongue. So it might be a way to track down the culprit. Any friends suddenly appear with a sudden lisp. And hair. Now there's a lot of folklore about hair, using it in divination to predict how long you will live, who you will marry, for instance. There's much about disposal of hair too. When you cut it, or what's in your comb, as it was thought it could tell a lot about you if it went into the wrong hands. Of course, we now know that is the case, with science able to use DNA from hair to find out, well, just about anything. Although one piece of folklore I'm struggling with is curing a child with whooping cough by taking a hair from their head and making a hare sandwich, then feeding it to a dog. And then the dog would get the child's cough instead of the child getting it. Bit of a Shaggy Dog story, perhaps.
Very good. And there's a handy tip there for all you warlocks and witches. Invest in a pair of eyebrow tweezers and people won't realise you're a wicked person. We're now going urban myth busting again, and our location this time is the Norfolk Broads in England. According to the myth, if you stand next to Potter Heigham Bridge on the night of the 31st of May, you will hear the thundering sound of horses' hooves and the screech of a carriage's wheels until a blazing coach appears over the crest of the bridge before crashing into the river that flows beneath it and sinking into the water, never to be seen again. Until next year. The background to this myth is a certain Lady Carew sought the help of a local witch to ensure her daughter Evelyn was able to snare a wealthy bachelor, Sir Geoffrey Hazlitt, who lived at nearby Bastwick Manor. The witch created a love potion but would not accept any monetary payment. Instead, she made Lady Carew promise that if the potion worked, whatever the witch asked for would be granted. Lady Carew agreed. The potion was given to Sir Geoffrey at a hunting party in nearby King's Lynn, and it clearly worked, as a few months later Sir Geoffrey and Evelyn married on the 31st of May 1741. Following a lavish wedding at Norwich Cathedral, the bridal party returned to Bastwick for the reception, but at the stroke of midnight, the party was interrupted by the doors crashing open. Stood there was a hideous skeleton who kidnapped the new bride and carried her away in a carriage drawn by 4 black horses. The rest of the party gave chase, but as the coach reached Potter Heigham Bridge, it burst into flames, tumbled into the water, with Lady Evelyn still inside. This was the payment the witch demanded for her potion. To add further misery to this story, when the distraught bridegroom and his friends returned to Bastwick Manor, they found that that too was on fire, and soon the old manor house burned to the ground. Undoubtedly a sad, sad story, and a lesson for all pushy mothers, but, and there are a lot of buts here. We start off with the fact there is no record of any Geoffrey Hazlitt marrying an Evelyn Carew in Norwich in May 1741, or at any other time. Yes, there was a manor house at Bastwick owned by a Sir Geoffrey Hazlitt, and it did burn down, but that was 100 years earlier in the 17th century. And, despite the clearly spelled out date, no ghost hunters or paranormal investigators have ever seen any supernatural manifestations on the bridge. So what is the explanation? It turns out this is not so much fake news as a hoax haunting, as the whole story was dreamed up in the early 1930s by Charles Sampson, a Harley Street surgeon and regular visitor to the Norfolk Broads. His collection of stories, Ghosts of the Broads, was originally published by the Yachtsman Publishing Company in 1931 and intended as a series of ripping yarns to entertain boating enthusiasts taking sailing holidays on the Norfolk Broads. Apart from retelling some well-known Broads legends, almost all the ghost stories were the product of Sampson's imagination. However, his use of actual historical characters, like Sir Geoffrey, combined with fictional real-life eyewitnesses and plausible-sounding quotations from equally fake historical chronicles, rather muddied the waters. The big problem came 40 years later, when the collection was reprinted in 1973 and the new publisher neglected to mention the stories were all works of fiction. In fact, the reprint stimulated a Broads ghost hunting community, the Borderline Science Investigation Group, who treated Sampson's book as a work of reference and, in their own words, spent many long and futile hours waiting in cold, dark and uncomfortable locations, hoping to see at least one of the apparitions mentioned in the book, before they finally realised it was all a hoax. The fact is, in the nearly 90 years since the book was first published, none of Samson's ghosts have ever been seen. Still, if it's any consolation, modern-day visitors to Potter Heigham can watch the daytime spectacle of people taking boating holidays on the Broads colliding with the bridge as they fail to navigate its very low arch. Plenty of curses from them, but no skeletons or blazing carriages. Time now for some more practical magic. The Wiccan pagan festival of Mabon and the autumn equinox, which this year takes place on the 22nd of September, is a liminal time, the midpoint between the longest day and the shortest day, when the forces of light and darkness are in balance. Not so much opposing forces as complementary forces. This is therefore a perfect time to cast a balancing spell, to regain some equilibrium in your life, to cast aside those old things you want to be rid of and to embrace the new you. In fact, when you think about it, this is exactly what happens in the outside material world when people come back from their summer vacations, having spent their holidays thinking about their lives and futures, and launch into the autumn with new initiatives or take up new opportunities and careers. But back to our spell. You will need 1 black candle and 1 white candle, plus a length of black ribbon and a length of white ribbon, plus a black Sharpie type marker pen and a white marker pen. These are sometimes called chalk markers. How long is the piece of ribbon? I can't tell you this, as you are going to be writing on it, and the length will depend upon how much you have to say, as well as how big your handwriting is. Light the 2 candles. In this spell they are primarily for focus, to help you get into the zone and to ignite your magic. Take the white marker and write on the black ribbon something you want to remove or reduce from your life. Perhaps less stress at work. Then, with the black marker, write on the white ribbon something you want to bring into your life or increase in your life. Perhaps spending more time outside of work enjoying nature. Remember, this spell is all about balance and equilibrium. What you remove must be balanced out by what is added. It can be about your physical and mental health, about your work-life balance, about your love life and personal relationships, time perhaps to dump that so-called shallow toxic friend and spend more time with people who care for you. It can even be something as simple as healthier living. By all means resolve to eat less cake, but remember the equilibrium. Balance it out by resolving to eat more fresh fruit. When you've finished your list, which can be as long or as short as you choose, take the 2 ribbons and line them up back to back so the sides with the writing on are facing outwards, and begin knotting them together. Tie a knot at the top and then add another knot between each of your pairs of resolutions until you reach the end, when you should tie a final knot at the bottom of the ribbon. Now, here's the spell. As every time you tie a knot, recite this chant. As day is to night, as dark is to light, find the perfect balance within me, so my life I can live in perfect harmony. By the power of 3 times 3, this is my will, so mote it be. When you've finished, snuff out the candles because your work is done and it is time for the magic to take over. Roll up the knotted ribbon, which is now your lucky charm, and keep it about you until you achieve the balance you were looking for. Good luck.
Find us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or email us at urbanfantasist@icloud.com or follow us on Twitter at urban_fantasist.
We're now going over to the Forum in Norwich to talk to Simon Michael Morgan and James Ducker about a new play they've created based on 2 of the best-known M.R. James supernatural horror stories.
Yes. Okay. Right, I'm here with Simon Michael Morgan and James Ducker of the Strange Fascination Theatre, and
you're putting on a production this autumn based on a couple of the M.R. James ghost stories. Can you tell me which ones you're doing?
This year we're doing A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Land, and a version of A Warning to the Curious, which I've adapted both of them for the stage. Some things about the first one there, A Whistle I Come to You, is that it doesn't actually lend itself for stage adaptation, but what we've tried to do is adapt both of them so that they will work very well, hopefully, on stage, highlighting some of the themes of those two stories.
Yeah, because I mean, we've all seen the old TV adaptations, and they're very Norfolky.
Yes.
Involve lots of running along beaches, being chased. So, how do you address that part? Because a lot of people are probably going to have that image in their head.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael Gordon.
Yeah, that's right. And the Lawrence Gordon Clark versions obviously were filmed for the television, and of course film's a medium where you can really explore all these kind of things. On the stage you have to very much create that world through more immediate means, such as stylization. And what we've tried to do with the both of them is take those iconic scenes and create more of a sense of the claustrophobia of them, without having the luxury of a actual beach chase. So hopefully it'll work. We've got lighting effects and things like that. Yeah.
It's also the text as well lends itself to actually building the atmosphere that you want to get, and the chase doesn't necessarily have to be a visual thing.
Yeah.
I'm very much looking forward to, especially Whistle I'll Come to You, just how we build all that suspense and the whole thing, way it builds and builds and builds to a crescendo, will be quite a fun journey for.
Yeah, and it's all the more immediate because it is so claustrophobic on the stage. We're not taking the audience. It's not promenade, so we're not taking the audience anywhere. We're going to really have this microscope on what Parkins is doing and whatnot. So yeah.
Yeah. Given M.R. James' stories were written over 100 years ago, and even the classic TV versions were now 50 years old, why are they still so popular today? What's the attraction?
It is the mystique of them, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
And people really enjoy it. I mean, there's the ghost stories that go around Norwich here as well. The old wives' tales, they're fantastical to listen to. But the M.R. James stuff, because it's stood the test of time a lot better and can be adapted, it adds a new layer to it if you modernise it at all, but also when it comes to the stage, putting it in a set time period is actually a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, I think for me they speak to those ancient fears of humankind. There's that everyday horror that is found on that sunny day, that superstition that hinders even our rationality today, I think. That shadow at the corner of the eye or the bump in the night. There's always that primordial sense in the human psyche of what lies behind the veil, and I think M.R. James really encapsulates that in a lot of his stories. Whilst he could have been writing today. I do feel that his themes and his ideas, he could have been writing today quite easily. He would have set a lot of his stories in the modern day. I mean, they were obviously very contemporary at the time. So I just think that he has this amazing knack of creating a sensibility of the what if. Really, I think Stephen King can do that quite well in his short stories as well. But and Arthur Machen did it back in the day as well. This kind of what the hell was that I just saw? How can it possibly be true? I'm a rational man. So there's that kind of fear, which is timeless. Yeah.
I mean, another feature in M.R. James is that, he himself said he wrote supernatural horror stories. Some of his ghosts or manifestations are actually very horrible and wreaking vengeance. They're not sort of white ladies floating past making noises. Yeah. They're things that kill you and tear your face off.
Yeah, he's got a very high moral standing, as he was a high moral compass. But he's also, for example, Parkins. Paul Parkins. All he does is He doesn't believe. That's all. His intellectualism is his downfall. What? That's nasty, isn't it? You know.
And why do you think that there seems to be a very strong East Anglian connection? I mean, obviously the two stories you're doing are set by James in East Anglia, but there just seems something that this is, M.R. James' country.
Yeah.
There's a feel about the Norfolk landscape, East Anglian landscape.
A lot of open space.
Yeah.
Especially nowadays when you look at the older buildings, the towns on the outskirts. Those little villages that have like derelict buildings, they lend themselves to being wonderfully creepy.
Yeah.
And we were in an abandoned air base.
Yeah.
And recently, I had a bat bunker, and it was the most ridiculously creepy thing I've ever seen.
Yes.
And it just had a set of concrete steps just outside. Norfolk and Suffolk,
they're ancient. They're ancient,
and they lend themselves to these stories so wonderfully well, because there is so much space between towns, between civilization, I should say.
That's very true. It's an ancient landscape. I'm Welsh, which you probably can hear, and my land, my homeland, that's an ancient homeland as well. However, here I think, as James said, there's this expanse of land. These beaches, they go on for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles, and you can just see that dark figure imperceptibly, and it's coming towards you and all that kind of thing. And I always think of James when I'm walking on a beach. I always think of looking over my shoulder and seeing that figure running towards me. He's tapped into the psyche in that respect so deeply. Those night terrors that we had as children and whatnot, where you're trying to run away, but you can't run away, no matter how much effort you make. And for me, that's M.R. James, that sense of that fear encroaching upon you no matter what you do, and you're powerless to do it. And I think that the landscapes are just that wonderful framework and setting for that kind of terror. Yeah.
In your adaptations, you've got Daisy Plackett playing. She's actually in the production.
Yes, she is.
What's she doing? Because M.R. James is remarkably thin women in terms of his plays. There's Mrs. Mothersoul, who's the witch in The Ash Tree, and she gets hung in the first scene. Yes, that's about it.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I was saying, I've kind of touched upon it, that M.R. James's themes are quite universal. The human conditions. I've taken A Warning to the Curious, and I've made the main character a woman in that. I've adapted that so that it's a young woman as opposed to an older man trying to seek the crown. The reason I did that is because of the universal themes. I think that this kind of M.R. James terror is universal. You don't necessarily need these labels. It's controversial, I think. I think it will be very controversial to the purists. Yes, absolutely. But I would urge them to come along and see the production and by all means talk to me about it. Daisy also designs the costumes and the set and makes the properties and all that kind of thing for our shows. Daisy and I actually run the company together. She's a very strong actress, I think. She has a grounding in theatre. She studied at Rose Bruford, so I think that it's not unusual for her to be on stage. She's very good at it, I think.
Yeah. She's wonderful on stage as well.
Yeah.
Very, very watchable.
Yeah.
And good at character.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, she's a very good character actress, and she believes in what she's doing. She really has influenced the adaptation. She very much sits there, and I'm going, what about this? She goes, well, I don't think that's any good. I don't think that you should try and do that with it. I think that's a bit too much. So she's very much my conscience.
Right. What about your first encounters with M.R. James? My first was reading an old Boys' Own magazine, and they had the Wishing Wells story in, which is really very horrible, about basically a naughty Boy Scout who gets grabbed by ghouls and turned into a ghoul himself and hung. But what about your encounters?
Mine was the Lawrence Gordon Clark,
Right.
A Whistle I'll Come to You. That absolutely terrified and fascinated me as a young boy. It was on at Christmas, as they were Christmas ghost stories, and I think that was my first encounter watching that on television, being absolutely captivated, wide-eyed by that figure on the beach.
Yeah.
by the ending of that version as well, the way that they did that stark ending where his intellectualism, his reason is stripped, and you can really see the problems and the issues that his mind is racing through at that point at the end of that adaptation. And of course, Hornden's characterization was definitive, wasn't it, of Parkins? I mean, you know, in the book, and he's a younger man, isn't he?
But Hornden, he does such a wonderful, eccentric, almost, I suppose, by modern standards, we call it autistic, wouldn't we? He's on the spectrum there, isn't he? In his mannerisms and all this kind of stuff, and his eccentricity. So yeah, it was that, but it influenced everything that I tried to write when I was growing up, because I've been writing since I was a kid and stuff. You know, I would always see in the distance shapes following me, and my earliest ghost stories that I wrote myself always had M.R. James influences. Yep. You know, the thing following you. He really touched that. Yeah, so I think that was for me.
What about you, James?
Well, actually, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't aware of his influence on my life until actually very, very recently, when looking at some of the roles and the themes that he had touched upon in previous stories. Actually going back and going, oh yeah, I do remember watching that, and then seeing it, that exact theme, the Man on the Beach type of thing, being stolen in another TV show, and then suddenly the puzzle pieces coming together, and suddenly going, actually, I've probably watched M.R. James unconsciously for a very long time. Yeah. And of course, since being part of this production, sort of looking at it, looking at his writing, his style, looking at absolutely everything, just to kind of get a grasp of what I'm doing, has opened my eyes a little bit more. So it's up until very, very recently that I actually haven't actually acknowledged it. But obviously, I would have been very young when I first saw that sort of thing. But then, being from a large family, I probably was turned off that very, very quickly.
Yes. Yeah. And finally, what are the dates? When's it playing?
Right. Well, we're not. It's only a mini tour, really. So it's at the Fisher Theatre Bungay on the 28th of October, and their website is www.fishertheatre.org. It's at the Seagull Theatre in Lowestoft on the 17th of November, and their website is www.theseagull.co.uk. And then we're at the Atrium in North Walsham on the 2nd of December, and you can get tickets for that by calling 01692 218 060.
Simon, James, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Those dates again: Bungay 28th October at the Fisher Theatre, Lowestoft 17th November at the Seagull Theatre, and North Walsham 2nd December at the Atrium.
Right, still on the subject of the theatre, earlier this week saw the premiere of a new play, The Hartlepool Monkey, at the Stratford Circus Arts Centre in East London. It's about the legend that the people of the northeast seaport of Hartlepool once hanged a monkey, believing it to be a French spy. The year was 1805, in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, when a French warship was wrecked off the coast of Hartlepool. The only survivor was the ship's mascot, a monkey that had been dressed in a miniature uniform. And the people of Hartlepool, they've never seen a Frenchman or a monkey before, so they're unsure what to do with this strange creature that gibbered in a language they couldn't understand. But when it bit the parson, they concluded it must be a dangerous French spy, so they promptly lynched it from the yardarm of a fishing boat. Of course, there could have been a much darker side to this story, namely that it was not a monkey they hanged, but a powder monkey. And they're the small boys who were employed on the warships in those days to carry barrels of gunpowder from the magazines to the gun decks. England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Newton Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
I recently heard a friend of ours tell her son, "Don't go running with those scissors, you'll have someone's eye out," which got me thinking, is there really a problem with people having their eyes poked out with scissors? If you look online, the US Consumer Product Safety Commission has a fascinating database called the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System. And this reveals that actually there are quite a substantial number of injuries turning up in accident and emergency departments every year involving children who have been injured with scissors. It sounds quite awesome, except when you then compare it with the number of children who are injured playing on normal playground equipment, it soon disappears into a very small figure. It also reports that since 1997, so we're looking 20 years now, they've only been 19 scissor-related incidents involving running, and none of those involved eyes being poked out. Indeed, it appears that a far greater risk is children putting scissors in their pockets and sitting on them and then getting buttock injuries. As for the rest of the scissor-related injuries, they are caused by the blade, by people cutting themselves while they are cutting paper or fabric or anything else. This tale of scissors got me thinking about some of the superstitions and folklore surrounding scissors. Did you know that if you use scissors on New Year's Day, you will cut off any fortune that was coming your way? Apparently you should also put scissors away during thunderstorms to decrease the likelihood of the house being struck by lightning. I think this is rather like we used to be told when we were kids that we had to unplug the television during a thunderstorm in case the lightning came down there. Being made of metal, of course, scissors have the power to cut and are regarded as quite potent objects in superstition. For example, if you drop a pair of scissors, or if you drop a pair and they stick into the floor, this constitutes a death omen, although it does vary from culture to culture. And there's a similar superstition saying if you do drop some scissors on the floor, the person who dropped them shouldn't pick them up themselves. Instead, he or she should ask a friend to pick them up, or failing this, the scissors should be trodden on before being touched. I suppose this is to earth the magic that's lurking in there. It's also suggested that before you use the scissors again, you should warm them between the hands. What else can we tell you about them? Well, it's suggested that scissors, along with knives, should never be given as presents unless the recipient hands over a coin or two in exchange, as though buying them in the usual way. Failure to do so may lead to the friendship between the two people being severed. See what they're doing there? Scissors, however, act as a deterrent against witches, and in former times they were often placed under a doormat to prevent any malevolent spirit from coming into the house. Ideally, they'd be placed in the open position so that they formed a cross. Got a couple more scissors-related superstitions for you. In Greece, if a pair of scissors is left gaping open on the table, it is said the Archangel Michael's mouth is open and ready to take the soul of some member of the family. While in parts of Africa, there are claims that scissors should never be opened and closed during a wedding celebration, and this will result in the groom becoming impotent. Ooh, I don't like to think about it. Imagine you've been invited to meet in an abandoned cemetery to go on a werewolf hunt on the night of the next full moon. It sounds like something out of a cheesy horror movie, but it happened to Janie and I last year when I was called in by a UK national newspaper to help investigate a reported werewolf sighting in the city of Hull in Yorkshire that might have been linked to the medieval legend of a werewolf known as Old Stinker. Old Stinker because it had a putrid breath. I'd written a book about the folklore of this area that talked about Old Stinker, hence my invitation. My suspicion, a suspicion confirmed what we actually saw on the night, was we were never going to encounter anything supernatural and that our creature would just be a normal flesh and blood dog, albeit a very large flesh and blood dog. That said, in preparing the trip, the thought did cross my mind, but what if? What if it actually was a real werewolf? I spent the days before the planned hunt going through sources, both ancient and modern, looking for advice on what precautions to take should I encounter a werewolf. However, what I discovered was much of the so-called lore surrounding werewolves owes more to 1930s movie plots and novels. In fact, Pretty much everything you've ever been told about werewolves is wrong. One of the first myths I encountered is that Christian religious symbols, such as crucifixes, offer protection against werewolves. Busted. There is no evidence in folklore, although it is a popular trope in fantasy fiction, that werewolves fear or are repelled by any form of religious symbolism or ritual, whether belonging to Christianity or any other religion. Possibly because we're so used to seeing vampires and werewolves now interacting together in the same movie, there is an assumption that what works with vampires, silver crucifixes, holy water, also works with werewolves. It doesn't. Next, the plant world. If you look at the folklore of plants and herbs, you'll frequently see mention that mistletoe, ryegrass and mountain ash are all natural werewolf repellents. It's even suggested that if you are being chased by a werewolf, running into a field where a rye crop is growing will save you. As our destination was an inner city area, and it would be several months until harvest time anyway, I knew ryegrass was a non-starter. However, it's worth noting wolves of all kinds are notoriously bad at climbing trees, so if you can find a tree and clamber up it, you will be safe. What about this herb called wolfsbane? Because of its toxic nature, aconitum, also known as monk's hood, devil's helmet and wolfsbane, has traditionally been regarded as one of the most potent natural defences against werewolves. It's certainly true that in the past the toxins extracted from these plants within the aconite family were used to create poisonous coatings for the spears and arrows used in wolf hunts, which is how the plant originally got its name, and not just wolves. The Japanese used to use it to kill bears, and the inhabitants of the Aleutian Isles even use it to hunt and kill whales. Also known as the Queen of Poisons, aconitum is one of the most poisonous and dangerous plants in the world. But herein lies the problem, for although there is little doubt it could kill a werewolf, or pretty much any other creature, natural or supernatural, there is no evidence it would ever work as a repellent. There is also the fact aconitum is so toxic that even touching it without wearing gloves can be fatal to humans. As recently as 2014, an inquest into the death of Nathan Greenway, a gardener in Hampshire, England, recorded that his death from multiple organ failure may have been caused by him merely brushing against a wolfsbane plant in a greenhouse. Apparently, when he was first taken to hospital, his condition was so desperate that the doctors thought he was suffering from Ebola. There is therefore a very real risk that in preparing your aconite poison, you may actually be exposing yourself to more danger than you would actually if you did encounter a werewolf. As for the suggestion that aconitum-based poisons could be mixed with holy water and put into water super soakers for squirting at werewolves, and I really have seen that suggested, let me get this straight. You are proposing to stand up against a werewolf, which lore legend suggests is an extra large wolf with superhuman powers, armed with just a water pistol? Given their shaggy coats, would the poison even reach their flesh before they were upon you and ripping out your throat? So what about silver bullets? Or even better, silver bullets that have been filled with liquid quicksilver or mercury. We all know the theory. A silver bullet will kill a werewolf stone dead. And if it's one of those shape-shifting wolves, the dead creature will revert back to its original form. Busted. This is a myth that can be traced back to a couple of movies in the 1930s, The Werewolf of London, 1935, and The Wolfman. The same goes for the legend of the Beast of Gévaudan. This is a historical incident dating back to France in the years 1764 to 1767, when the residents of the Haute-Loire region were plagued by wolves that attacked and killed, depending on the sources, between 60 and 113 people, as well as injuring another 50. Not surprisingly, the wolf or wolves, there were reports they attacked as packs, were attributed with supernatural powers and inhuman cunning. There is actually a suggestion the real Beast of Gévaudan was actually something more exotic, such as a lion that had escaped from a private zoo, which would explain the injuries the victims suffered. At the time of the original hunt, the weapon used against the beast were conventional spears and bullets. However, at some point during the 19th century, 100 years later, a retelling of the story had the beast eventually being slain with a silver bullet that had been blessed by a priest. One possibility is the later author confused the name of one of the hunters, a man called Argent, equals silver, so shot by silver became shot with silver. In fact, if you look at the accounts in European history of werewolves being hunted and slain, it would appear they are fundamentally creatures of flesh and blood and can be killed by conventional swords, spears and guns, as well as, according to one woodcut I've seen, being hanged on a gallows and burned at a stake. Incidentally, for anyone in the UK, the unsuitability of silver bullets comes as something of a relief, as our local gun laws make it virtually impossible to legally obtain and own firearms. For everyone else, it means you needn't go to the trouble and expense of sourcing silver ammunition, which is also fortuitous, as ballistic tests indicate silver bullets are both less accurate and slower than that of comparable size lead bullets.
You're listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Divination, or foretelling the future, fortune telling. Well, we'd all like to be able to do that. And here's just a few weird and lesser known ways to do it. If tea leaf readings, that correct term for that is tasseography, is not working for you. Okay, asparamancy. Yes, it's done by tossing asparagus in the air and reading the pattern when it falls on the ground. Only one practitioner of it seems, but she's had massive media coverage, so thinking anyone can just really choose a comedy vegetable and grab 15 minutes of fame. Molybdenation, divination by molten metal. The method originates in ancient Greece, and it's still common in New Year tradition of the Nordic countries, apparently. Tin is melted on a stove and poured into a bucket of cold water. The resulting shape is either directly interpreted as an omen for the future or is rotated in a candlelight to create shadows whose shapes are then interpreted. And I really like this one because it sounds like fun and you get a nice little original sculpture or jewellery out of it to keep. Botonomancy, burning plants, particularly their leaves and branches, and then interpreting the shapes. Batrachomancy. That's studying frog habits and croaks.
Frogs, not bats.
No, frogs. Live frogs. No need to kill them. Tyromancy. Use of rotten or spoiled cheese to predict events. Nagam. That uses spiders rushing around a dish to move objects in the dish, then reading the placement of the objects. Right, so I'm off to grill the cheese about the lottery this week. Get it?
Well, I've been licking my psychic frog and he says no chance.
Ugh.
Still on the subject of divination, did you know, Janie, that the Celtic tribal queen Boudica, or Boadicea as she used to be called when we were at school, had a psychic hare, as in a big rabbit, that could predict whether or not her army would be victorious in battle against the Roman legions. Basically, if it ran in the direction of the enemy, that was lucky. If it ran in the opposite direction, that was bad news and a defeat was on the cards. And now, by one of those weird coincidences, what do Harry Potter and Boudica have in common? As you'll know from the books, or if you were in London 3 weeks ago on the 1st of September for Harry Potter Day, when his son sets off on the Hogwarts Express for his first day at school, trains for Hogwarts depart from platform 9 3/4 at London's King Cross railway station. And one of the many locations that claim to be the final resting place for Boudica is actually between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross station. I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's show that this time of the year coincides with the anniversary of some very important events during the notorious Salem witch trials. The year is 1692, and September 22nd was the date of the fourth and final batch of executions, when 8 more so-called witches were hanged. At that time in the American colonies, as in England, witches and warlocks were hanged rather than burned at the stake. And I say so-called witches because it was subsequently discovered the allegations against them were entirely false, and the whole of Salem, Massachusetts had fallen prey to a bad case of paranoia and mass hysteria. However, that's a story for another show, and tonight I want to focus on the fate of just one man, Giles Corey. At the time of the witch trials, Corey was a well-meaning but grumpy old farmer. He was 81 years old. He was wealthy, but unfortunately he had made enemies in the colony, as 15 years earlier he had beaten to death one of his indentured servants. A court subsequently fined him for this offence, all of which throws an interesting perspective on the colony's values, where practising witchcraft was punishable by death, but killing servants was a minor misdemeanour. In due course, both Giles and his wife Martha, she would become one of the women hanged on the 22nd, were accused of witchcraft. However, Giles refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. Now, at this time in history, refusing to enter a plea automatically exposed the accused to a form of legal torture called peine forte dure, more commonly known as pressing. Basically, the accused would be stripped naked, placed in a shallow pit, and a heavy wooden door placed over his body. Then heavy stones and iron weights would be placed on the door until either the prisoner entered a plea or was crushed to death. In the case of Giles Corey, he knew that if he pleaded guilty, he would die. He also realised that if he pleaded not guilty, the court was inevitably going to convict him, so he would still die. And he knew that if he refused to enter any plea at all, he would also die. So why did he opt for torture? Because if he refused to plead, he died in full possession of his property and estate, which would have otherwise been forfeited to the government. In fact, a number of Salem officials, including Sheriff George Corwin, and we'll hear more about him later, had already revealed themselves as being a little too keen to get their grubby blood-stained fingers on the assets of the executed witches. In the event, it took Giles Corey 2 days to die, eventually succumbing to being pressed to death on the 19th of September. Apparently every time Sheriff Corwin asked him to plead yea or nay to witchcraft, Giles would reply, "More weight," goading the sheriff and his men to add more rocks to the pile already crushing him. Accounts at the time say Sheriff Corwin would frequently climb onto the rocks lying across Giles Corey's body so he could peer down into Corey's bulging eyes. And in one instance, when Giles Corey's tongue was pressed out of his mouth, the sheriff used his cane to force it back into place. But then, when death was almost upon him, Giles Corey shouted out one final comment at Corwin. "Damn you," he said, "I curse you and Salem." 4 years after Giles Corey's death, Sheriff Corwin died suddenly from a heart attack at the age of just 30. But there's more. After Corwin's death in 1696, every single subsequent holder of the position of Sheriff of Essex County, which was the official title of the Salem Sheriff, either died or resigned as a result of heart or blood ailments. In fact, the curse was only broken as recently as 1991, when the sheriff's office was relocated from Salem to Middleton. And then there's the legend that Giles Corey's ghost walks the Howard Street Cemetery, the site of his death and probable final resting place, whenever a disaster is set to strike Salem. In particular, his ghost was seen by witnesses before the disastrous Great Salem Fire in 1914, which destroyed much of the old town. That fire, incidentally, actually started near Gallows Hill, where Corey's wife Martha and 18 other people were hanged for witchcraft. I leave you with two final thoughts. Why did Salem authorities choose the 22nd of September for the final round of witchcraft executions, a date which coincides with what is now called Mabon, one of the principal Sabbats of the pagan Wiccan calendar. And, given the apparent potency of Giles Corey's final curse, which blighted the lives of Salem sheriffs for 300 years, perhaps he really was a warlock after all, the one genuine practitioner of the dark arts in a town overrun by paranoia and mass hysteria. Giles Corey has the dubious distinction of being the only American to ever have been pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea. And that's all we have time for tonight. Janie and I will be back for our next show on Thursday the 5th of October. But in the meantime, spare a thought for clowns, the circus variety. According to the Sun newspaper in the UK, clowns are saying their business is being hit by the big success of the latest Stephen King movie adaptation, It, which features a very frightening clown. One clown told the paper its portrayal of a killer clown is putting parents off booking the performers for children's parties. Possibly, or it may just be that kids today no longer find clowns that funny. And if you are walking past a graveyard late at night and hear spooky organ music coming from a darkened church, don't be frightened, as it may not be a ghost. Earlier this summer, police went to the Church of St Philip and St James in Ilfracombe after reports that eerie music could be heard coming from the church at midnight. Turned out it was the church's organist taking advantage of a warm summer's evening to catch up on some nocturnal practice at the keys. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to Urban Fantasist with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of weird tales, urban legends, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter at urban_fantasist. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Urban Fantasist. The Urban Fantasist radio show is produced at Goat Pen Studios, Norfolk, England. Music by Jason Wick of Goat Pen. Find them at goatpenstudios.co.uk or on Facebook at Goat Pen Studios.